Ned, I saw it. It went live, Ned.
Yes,
Ned,
it went live. We are
Ned,
live.
Ned, it's live, Ned. See? I'm seeing it right now. It's live.
I know it's live. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 44 of the TechForge podcast. And yes, it has been a couple of weeks since you've seen us due to a number of circumstances in our various lives. Myself having to have a medical procedure done, and also with Jason starting a brand new job.
I've got two jobs, Ned. I have two jobs.
Well, you had your old job, but you started a new one.
Yes, this is true.
So my point being, we've had to juggle our schedule quite a bit. We don't know if this is where we're going to settle for when we record or when we upload this podcast, but for now, this is what we're working with.
Cool.
And so in the meantime, while we have been away, Computex has come and gone. And with it, we have had some major announcements from AMD, Intel, NVIDIA, and a number of the other OEMs within the PC hardware space. And so we're going to try to cover the highlights of Computex 2019 in today's episode.
Really?
I've tried in compiling this week's show notes to limit it to about a dozen stories that I thought were particularly pertinent. But all you have to do is type Computex 2019 into your favorite search engine, and you'll see there are literally thousands of things that they show off at this show. So we picked the very highlights for our show. And so let's just jump straight into it. Of course, the biggest announcement, the thing that was the highlight of the show, that was the keynote to kick it all off, was the AMD Ryzen keynote led by Dr. Lisa Su. And there she announced a number of things, but of course the big thing that everyone had been waiting for was AMD's Ryzen 3000 processors.
Mm-hmm.
And so our first article from the evening, this is a non-text, basically summary of the keynote. AMD Ryzen 3000 announced 5 CPUs, 12 cores at $499, up to 4.6 gigahertz, PCIe 4.0, excuse me. And it's all coming on July 7th.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what these review at. I know that there have been some people say, "Well, I'm let down because there's not a 16 core 5 gigahertz chip."
Yet.
True.
That's the key word. Yet.
True. So this is on a 7 nanometer TSMC node, which is still maturing. I have no idea what their yields are like. However, with this fantastic chiplet design, it gives them flexibility for better binning.
And I have no doubt that at some point we will see a Ryzen 9 3950X with 16 cores, 32 threads at 4.6 to 5.0 gigahertz.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure. But the really impressive things were the 15% IPC improvement.
Which there was a controversy with that, but we'll get to that in a minute.
Yeah. And the clock speeds and the prices, man. I mean, when they had the initial announcement, so I watched it live, and so they announced the 8-core parts first, and I was kind of like, I was kind of hoping for more cores, at the Ryzen 7 tier.
Right.
But then they started kind of getting into it, then they were showing off how much cache they had and what the TDPs were. Like the TDP. So the 3700X at a 65 watt TDP, and you're basically getting the same performance as a 9900K at 65 watts.
Yeah, that is pretty impressive. And the 3800X, which is the new Ryzen 9 part, the 38 and 3900X at 105 watts. but having 12 cores and 24 threads. To put that in perspective, my 1800X is a 105 watt part.
So is my... Yeah, go ahead.
And it's an 8-core, 16 thread.
Yeah, my 2700X is technically 105 watt. Now it's stock. I've got it at stock underwater, and when I'm running a power virus against it, like I generally just stick to prime 95, and it'll consume upwards of around 120 watts at most. So take that with a grain of salt. The TDP is taken at the base clock. So I would expect, not assume, I would expect the 12 core part to consume around 30% more power at load or at workloads that are working most of the cores, if not all of them. I would expect it to consume around 33% more power than the 8 core.
Sorry for the peek at my Discord there.
That's all right.
I was sharing the screen here, though, because we called it way back at CES when they showed off the 8-core chip that only had the single chiplet.
Oh, right.
Lo and behold, indeed, this is a 2-chiplet design with an I/O die. And so
that 12-core part is extremely interesting, but the 8-core 3800X is also very interesting. And I'll get to some reasons why. So we know that these are 8-core CCXs. I'm going to call them CCXs. I'm not sure what, or chiplet. Each one of these chiplets is an 8-core, right? So I'm assuming that the 12-core probably is 2 6-core chiplets, although I don't know. We probably have to wait for reviews to see exactly how those will be configured.
It would make sense.
They might go with something loose, but they're going to have some decent binning, I would think, to get the 4.6 boost out of them. Whereas the 8-core will be 1 chiplet. So from a gaming perspective, if you're including a second chiplet, you're introducing potential latency. So
right,
theoretically, the 3800X could be the better gaming chip. Since both of them have the same TDP power envelope, you could say that the 3800X will be at higher clock speeds more often than the 12-core part. So with that and the lower latencies in mind, I think the 3800X might be the better gaming chip.
And that would largely line up with what we've seen in the past with regards to Ryzen 7 versus Threadripper.
True, and Ryzen 7 versus Ryzen 5.
Exactly.
So the 2600X often does better in just pure FPS. It's not much, but it often does better in FPS versus the 2700X. And the reason for that is because you're generally getting about 100 to 200 megahertz more out of a few of the cores on the 2600X versus the 2700X.
Correct.
Even though both have 2 core complexes. So, you're still dealing with the same latency, but typically the 2600X is a slightly better gamer, but it's like, you're really going to notice it kind of a thing. So.
Yeah. We have another picture here. This is the Ryzen 9 3900X. Again, with both dies.
So the triangle's on the lower right.
Oh, okay.
Yep,
right there.
I'm wondering how this would sit in most of the sockets. So I'm trying to remember how mine sits. I don't remember how mine sits. So I would expect most of the heat density to be on the side where the chiplets are.
Probably.
I wonder what that's going to be like from a cooling standpoint.
hold on. We might be able to answer this. Give me just a second. I've got a mini ITX AM4 board, and we can answer this question that way. So,
I've got a crap. I've got an AM4 board. I've got a full size. Hold on.
okay. Well, while we're waiting for him to come back, we'll take a look. Again, here we have the specifications for the Ryzen 3000 CPUs. The 3900X, 12 cores, 24 threads, 3.8 gigahertz base, 4.6 gigahertz boost, with 64 megabytes of L3 cache.
Huh? What's that?
At $499. Now, to me, that price is what really sets apart the 3900X.
Well, it's doing what the 1800X did when it first came out. Because at that point, all we had was 7700K on the mainstream, and then we had the only thing that we had at that point from Intel was HEDT.
Correct.
8-core, 16 thread. So they came out with similar or better performance at half the price. So that's what they're doing again, except it's less than half. So the 12-core HEDT part from Intel that it basically spanks is $1,100, right?
The 9920X, yes.
So, okay, so I have the mirror.
Okay.
Please forgive the heat paste that I have here. This used to be in the motherboard I had the 2700X in. So the triangle goes here, I think, down here.
Okay.
So okay, so the chiplets would sit right up here.
Yeah.
Right? Because the triangle on the picture you showed was here, which this is where that would line up as you're installing it on the board.
Which would make sense, because that would put the I/O die right next to the RAM slots.
Yeah.
And would put the chiplets closer to the power phases.
So if I've got if it's sitting like this, the chiplets are here. So if I have a water block, I want my cold water coming in here and going this way.
Yep.
Come out.
Ideally.
Okay. Which a lot of the water blocks you get do that. Okay. I can deal with that. So it should be the same on my other board, I think.
Right. So I won't go through the rest of this AnonTech article, but of course we include the link down below to all of the articles we use in a one-tab link that links to all of the articles. Basically, it goes through all of the announced processors, all 5 of them. I still think the 3700X at 65 watts, like you said, Jason, is just absolutely insane.
Yeah.
4.4 gigahertz at 65 watts.
Yep.
Insane.
Yep.
I mean, this week I am not using my Ryzen PC this week, unfortunately. I currently have it taken apart for maintenance, mostly upgrading the thermal paste and doing some cleaning. But I have my backup PC, which is a 7700, Core i7 7700. Kaby Lake processor from about 2 years ago. Solid. That part is 84 watts. And it is 4 cores, 8 threads.
Which I bet it consumes less power than that.
Probably most of the time, I would say so. But
only
when I have it at full tilt,
yeah,
which it is the non-K chip, so it's the standard 7700 because, well, through some judicious flips on Facebook Marketplace, I was able to come into possession of an H170 motherboard and a Core i7 7700. And so basically that chip with half as many cores and threads consumes more power, and it only boosts, because it's the non-K variant, to 4.1 gigahertz.
Really?
Yeah,
That's
the
kind of a
77
Debbie Downer.
Yeah, the 7700, because it is not overclockable, has a base clock of 3.6 gigahertz, just like the 3700X, and it only boosts to 4.1 on a single core.
Ah. So
It will do 4.0 on all 4 cores, though.
with the lower power envelope, I wonder, it'd be interesting to see comparisons between the 3700X and the 3800X under similar workloads, what they boost to.
Right.
Considering that they're designed for 2 different types of TDP ranges.
Yeah, the 3700X is the one you're going to want to use in, your office workstation type devices, because of the lower power draw. Whereas the 3800X is going to be the one that most enthusiasts want.
Well, yeah, and also for boards with weak VRMs on them.
Yeah, I do wonder if we'll see a non-X variant of the 3700X. And if so, if that one will be another low wattage part, or if that one's going to be something different.
I have no idea. They've the only non-X variant that they've introduced so far has been the Ryzen 5 part, right? The 3600.
Right. With the 3600X and the 3600.
Yeah.
So now, one of the other stories we're going to take a look at is Tom's Hardware was able to get their hands on the currently unannounced, but apparently very real, Ryzen 5 3400G. But
so I also am curious to see what the overclocking behavior of the TSMC process is versus what we're familiar with on the Global Foundry. Right? Because on Global Foundry, all the parts have a specific boost speed. So, like the 2700X, for example, has a boost speed of 4.3, but you're likely only going to see a 4.2 gigahertz all-core overclock. So, most of the 12 and 14 nanometer parts at the higher end will only all-core overclock 1 to 300 megahertz below their rated boost speeds. Now, if we use the Radeon 7 as a baseline for what we could potentially expect out of these new Ryzens, considering it is on the same TSMC 7 nanometer node, that does overclock very highly. In fact, a lot of people can get up to 2 to 2.1, 2.2 gigahertz on air, on the stock air cooler. So if we can see similar overclocking results, now we're seeing forum posts where people with engineering samples are able to get an all-core overclock of 4.8 or 4.5 at 1.35 volts. So that's very, very good.
because I was going to say, you at one time you had your 2700X locked to 4.2, correct?
I had it. Yeah, I could overclock it easily to 4.2. In fact, I've had it as high as 4.35. But
it was consuming something in like the 1.4, 1.45 volt range, right?
It was so at 1.25 volts, or 4.25 gigahertz, it was hitting that power wall. To get it stable at 4.3 gigahertz, I had to have it at 1.5 volts.
Oof.
And at that point,
territory.
Well, yeah. So at that point, it was hitting it was consuming between 180 and 220 watts of power.
Oof.
When I would run it under Prime 95, and it did seem a willing to clock higher. The highest overclock I've ever had and benchmarked on it is 4.35 gigahertz, but at that point, I'm having to give it way too much power, and it's getting beyond my capacity to cool. So then that's when I just backed off. I sat at 4.2 for a while, and then I was just like, you know what? I don't really see much of a performance gain over stock configuration. So then I put everything back to stock, and meh. It sits anywhere between 4 and 4.2 gigahertz. If I hit it with like a Cinebench or some kind of an all-core workload, it doesn't stray very far below 4 gigahertz. So, everyday feel, I would rather have the stability. I don't really feel any difference in performance. The benchmarks are higher, obviously, with the all-core overclock, but I'd rather have stability. So I just backed
That's
off.
kind of the one I ran into with 800X, which I'm able to get it to overclock to about 0.95 on slightly over stock voltages. I think like about 1.35.
Yeah,
but
I never really felt comfortable over 1.35 volts, to be honest.
Yeah, and honestly, at 3.95, it wasn't that much faster than what I could get by just letting Power Boost Overdrive do its thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I just returned it to stock.
Yeah.
So XFR and Power Boost Overdrive just kind of did their job.
Right.
All right. So yeah, I'm really excited about the Ryzen 3000 processors. The 3600 being 4.2 gigahertz boost, 6-core, 12-thread, 65-watt processor at $200. I mean, that is going to be the deal.
Oh yeah, that and the 3600X, you can stick those in just about any motherboard that has come out, and you're fine. The only time you should worry is if you're trying to go after an 8-core part and you've got a lower end B350, even some of the 70 level boards, you should worry a little bit. I mean, really, if you're gonna be getting an 8-core, regardless if it's 65 watt or not, you should be looking at something with a beefier VRM. So
yeah, something in the either the very high end of the X370 range or the higher end of the X470, X570 range.
Well, X470 for sure. I'm not sure what the X570 is gonna be. I mean, some of the VRMs I'm seeing on the X570 are just insane.
Yeah,
So,
Asus was talking about having, or Asus and Gigabyte were both talking about having 14 or 16 phase VRMs.
Yeah. I mean, they're insane. And I thought that the VRM on the Gaming 7 was insane because it didn't come close to overheating when I was pushing the limits of my 2700X. It was sitting at 50C. Regardless, it stays at 50C, regardless if it's stock or if it's pumping 200 watts at my CPU. 50C. It never goes any higher than it never goes above 60C. We'll just say that. So I wouldn't feel comfortable with this board in the 16 core. I think it'd be all right with a 12, but anyway. Yeah, the fact that we're getting 9900K performance at $400, well, $329. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how Intel has an answer.
Gotcha. And well, we know what AMD is bringing at the high end. or the high end and the mid range, with the Ryzen 5, the Ryzen 7, and the new Ryzen 9 branding.
Mm-hmm.
What we didn't see a whole lot of was their low end, the Ryzen 3 and the Ryzen and the 4-core Ryzen 5 parts. Well, apparently, Tom's Hardware on the Computex show floor managed to get their hands on the Ryzen 5 3400G.
Well, this isn't. It's branded, but it's not technically Zen 2.
Correct. It is Zen Plus.
Right.
So it is the same. It is the 12 nanometer architecture that was used on the Ryzen 2000 series, which is perfectly in keeping with what happened with the Ryzen 2000 APUs that were based on the original Zen architecture at 14 nanometers.
So take your 22 and your 2400G, upgrade the cores, upgrade the CPU cores a little bit, take off the heat paste, give them some solder, and boom. You've got your,
by and large, yes.
You've got your 32 and 3400G.
I'll share the article here just because they have some nice photos. Here you can see they have it on this colorful X570 board. Colorful is not a brand you hear about much in the United States, but it is a huge brand in Asia.
Interesting.
So they have an X570 demo here. You'll notice the CPU, they have it marked as simply Ryzen. They don't say what it is. However,
there's a video cable coming out of the back.
When Tom's Hardware poked around at the Computex booth, what they found is that the processor in Cinebench was named the Ryzen 5 3400G with Radeon Vega graphics. And you can see in Cinebench R15, these are the results they got. They got a CPU score of 752 CB and a CPU score of 162 CB, which, notice, puts it roughly on par with a Core i7 4770K. And that's roughly the same type of performance we saw, slightly less so, out of the 2400G. That it was performing, at least in single core task, roughly like a Haswell part.
Okay.
And they have some of the specs that they saw. Ryzen 5 3400G. This is no big surprise. 3.8 gigahertz base, 4.2 gigahertz boost, 4 cores, 8 threads. They don't know the TDP yet, but if it's like the 2400G, it's probably going to be another 65 watt part.
Even though it's not Zen 2, I mean, just the fact that they put it on Zen Plus, they're getting better. They're getting better core clocks out of it, and they've now soldered it. Thank you, AMD. I'm more excited about that aspect, actually.
Yeah, notice that they call this a Picasso APU. Picasso is important because that tells us these are not the Zen 2 chips, and that's confirmed when they say the technology is 12 nanometers. They're claiming Radeon RX Vega 11 graphics. Apparently, they don't have all the motherboard information filled out yet, although notice they has filled in for manufacturer and model default string. And here's the important thing. The important thing I wanted to show here. This is the CPU-Z CPU benchmark. They have a single-threaded score of 472.5 and a multi-threaded score of 2,454, which is not bad.
Well, what would that be comparable to, I wonder?
Well, hold on. I have CPU-Z installed on this machine. Let me see if I run CPU ID or CPU Z,
Okay,
I will bring it over here so that everybody can see it.
That's got me curious, Ned.
Okay. So I'm running a Core i7-7700 in this PC. If I bench it, wait for it, I get 2176.9 for the multi-threaded. And 415.4. So if we go back over here and compare, notice here the Ryzen 5 3400G is getting 472 and 2454. So this is actually performing slightly better than my Core i7-7700 in the same benchmark.
Well, of course, you're running stuff too right now.
I mean, that's fair. But if I include as reference, let's see, what do I have choices for reference CPUs? 1700. Let's see. They don't have a Ryzen APU to compare, so we will go with the closest analog in this case. This is the Ryzen 5 1600 for comparison. The Ryzen 5 1600, which is from around the same time period, had a single-threaded score of 364 and a multi-threaded score of 3108.
So I just ran mine. Now I'm running my 2700X stock. I've got this on an X470 motherboard, which is the Gaming 7. And I've got 32 gigs of, which is basically 4x8 config of G-Skill Trident Z 3200 megahertz RAM. It's not necessarily low latency, but my single threaded score is 444.8. And my multi-threaded score is 4,459.4.
The other comparison I wanted to show here, this is the reference numbers that CPU-Z has for the Ryzen 7 1800X. Now, that is the CPU in my main machine, the one that's currently down for a cleaning and maintenance. They claim a CPU single-threaded score of 400 and a reference and a multi-threaded score of 4,542.
Interesting.
So basically what this is saying is we have roughly 72, 73 points better on the single-threaded, and it's about half of what I would get on my 1800X in the multi-threaded, which is exactly what we'd expect.
So it's pretty good. Most of that score is going to be coming from the clock speed because the APU parts won't have the same level of, or the same amount of level 3 cache that the other Ryzens enjoy.
Correct.
So
one thing they did check, notice that the DRAM frequency they're running here, they are not running super fast RAM. 1064.5 megahertz, when you double that, is 2133.
interesting.
Although, according to CPU-Z, the DDR4 slots are supposed, or the slotted in RAM is supposed to be DDR4 2400 RAM. So
I think the takeaway, Ned, is don't upgrade from a 2400G. But if you're looking for an APU build, pick this over the 2400G if you're given the option, depending on price, of course. But
pretty much.
I mean, it's kind of neat. It's more of a small upgrade, really.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it is a relatively minor upgrade. And speaking of upgrades, if you're looking to get one of the new X570 motherboards, but you want to save up and use your first gen Ryzen CPU in it,
Oh.
unfortunately, you will not be able to.
Right.
Because X570 will not support first generation Ryzen chips. So some people got a little bit up in arms about this, saying, oh, this is AMD reneging on their promise to keep AM4, backwards compatible till 2020. Well, the question I would ask is, if you're buying a brand new X570 motherboard, why are you putting a first generation Ryzen chip on it?
Right.
It would be much, much
Right.
simpler and much, much smarter to just buy a cheap B350 board and put your first generation Ryzen chip on that until you can afford an X570 and a third gen or even a second gen Ryzen chip.
So AMD is doing something here that has never been done before. You've got 3 generations of processor that work on the same socket. And a large demographic of motherboards that will support all 3 generations. So, cry me a river, if first gen Ryzen parts that came out in 2017 don't work on a motherboard that is coming out in 2019.
I mean, on one hand, I can slightly understand it. I remember the horrible, horrible days of socket 775 compatibility, where you had to determine whether or not the CPU you were using would be compatible on the socket 775 board, because even though it physically fit, it didn't mean it would work.
Right.
I remember one of the biggest things was I had an Asus P5B Deluxe. Solid all-around socket 775 motherboard. Love that motherboard. I originally had a Q6600 on it. I went to go upgrade to a Q9550.
Mm-hmm.
The Q9550 would not work. So I had to upgrade my motherboard as well. Because even though it was the same physical socket, the Q9550 used different power layout and thus did not work.
Well, that's kind of typical Intel, though. Anytime they release a new CPU, you have to get a new motherboard.
And, the way I see it is this. With the X570, yes, okay, it's not going to support first-gen Ryzen parts. But your high-end X370 are going to support third-gen Ryzen parts, and I think that is far more important.
Yep.
So that if you can't afford a new motherboard right now, but you want one of the new shiny Ryzen 3000 chips, you can do that.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, assuming, as we always do, that you are realistic about your expectations given the VRM and power phases on your motherboard.
Mm-hmm.
Do not expect your cheap $65 B350 motherboard to be able to overclock a Core or a Ryzen 9 3900X.
It's not working. My computer keeps shutting down. I don't know why. Got a $500 processor on my $50 motherboard. It ain't working.
Again, just because you can does not mean you should. Also, this article from TechSpot mentions that the A320 chipset will not support third-gen Ryzen processors, which
if you're putting a Ryzen processor on an A320 chipset, there is something seriously wrong between your ears.
Well, I understand some people, they bought a pre-built from one of the OEMs, and they cheaped out and used an A320 motherboard. And yeah, that stinks, but A320 was never, ever, ever meant to employ high-end processors.
I wouldn't even put a Ryzen-based APU on an A320. Spend $20 more and get a B450 or a B350.
Pretty much.
$20.
Like we said just a few minutes ago, you can get B350 motherboards for $50 to $75 all day, every day.
Take your lunch 4 days to work instead of going to Taco Bell for lunch for 4 days. Mow one more lawn. Boom.
Not to mention, if you take your lunch instead of going to Taco Bell, your stomach will likely thank you.
Well, that's true. And you're saving $5. So you can get that B450 motherboard that's going to support, the 6-core Ryzen 3000 that you want to get on that cheap, B450 motherboard with 2 DIMM sockets. I'm going to be quiet.
So, just for reference, so that everything is made clear, this is the AM4 motherboard chipset solutions chart. And it's pretty straightforward. First-gen Ryzen processors are supported on everything from A320 to X470, but not X570. If you have a Ryzen 2000 or 3000 motherboard,
processor,
or Ryzen 2000 or 3000 CPU, it's going to work on pretty much any motherboard. However, if you have a processor, the high-end processors that do not have integrated graphics, it will definitely work on B450 and up boards, and there will be certain B350 and X370 boards that will get BIOSes updated for Ryzen 3000.
So I'm going to play a little game here, Mr. Ned. I'm going to go to Gigabyte's website.
Okay.
Right? I'm going to look at their X370. Let's see. Let's just pick an X370 motherboard here. So,
do you mind sharing your screen so we can take a look with you?
Yeah, let me see if I can do that here.
If you go over Hangouts, there should be a little green screen share button.
Yep.
There we are.
All right. So here on the
choose the present to everyone that when I talk, it doesn't cover it up.
Present to everyone. Chat.
I should be at the very top.
The what? You're breaking up.
If you are in the house window and you mouse over to the very top when you're presenting.
I don't see that option.
Okay. So I'm screen sharing as well. You should see a green bar across the top that says you are screen sharing with stop and present to everyone. You can tell we are totally professionals here.
Well, I don't often use Hangouts.
Well, I will just keep quiet while you show this off then.
I don't see that option, Ned. Anyway, so I'm going to select motherboards. Yeah, they must have changed the side a little bit. So we'll go down to chipset. X370, B350. Let's see. I don't want to look at the gaming 3. Where's the gaming 7? Okay. Here's the gaming K7. Specification. Support. BIOS. So they don't have a BIOS out yet. to support the new Ryzens. They do, however, so if I look at X470, now this is their lowest end X470 board. If I go to support, BIOS, their F40, which this same BIOS version, if I go to the Gaming 7, will also have this, but see this? Update new AGISA for 3rd gen Ryzen support. So if I were to flash this on my board I showed off earlier, I could technically support Ryzen 3rd gen. So I'll stop sharing.
And I have the X370 Gaming K5.
Okay.
So unfortunately, it doesn't look like there's going to be a BIOS to let me upgrade. But you know what? That's okay. Because honestly, it's about time for me to upgrade my system completely anyway. That's kind of why I am using the 7700 system while I bring the 1800X system down for maintenance.
Okay.
And so if you're looking for an X570 and you want to throw your 1st gen Ryzen on it, unfortunately, that's not going to work for you. But at this point, I can't really complain because you can get a Ryzen 5 1600 CPU for $120. You can get a B350 or a B450 motherboard for it for $75.
Right.
And you're set.
Yeah, if you're doing something like that, you don't want to go with an 8-core. Even if the 8-core is cheap, just go with the 6-core.
Of course, the one thing that AMD didn't talk about a whole lot at Computex, but they hinted at real strong, was Navi. Or, well, as it is now being officially called, the Radeon RX 5700 series.
Yep.
So, this is from WCCF Tech, but this is based on what they saw at Computex. So, AMD Navi RX 5700 brings RTX 2070 performance at half the die size. That's impressive in and of itself.
So there's a number of takeaways here. I mean, it is and it isn't. So if you look at RTX 2070, that's still a 104 part. And that's the first time a 70 level part has ever been on a 104 chip. Typically 104 is reserved for the 60 level part. So the 1060, for example, was a 104.
Like GP 104.
Correct. Now, TU 104 with Turing is 2060, 2070. If you were to look at the bare PCB of the NVIDIA based, when I say that, of the, I don't know what they call them right now. So if you were to take an RTX 2060 and an RTX 2070 PCB, lay them side by side, they're exactly the same. Exactly the same. So whereas the 1070 was a 102 level part. It was a 102 level chip. The GTX 1080 was a 102 level chip. The TU 102 is the RTX 2080. And honestly, there is a performance difference, obviously, between the 2060 and 2070, but the 2060 is just a torn down 2070, basically. What that tells me is they were initially planning on the 2070 to be the 60 level part, but instead they gave it They just made it a 2070. So with that in context, the Navi part is impressive, but it's basically a full replacement for Polaris.
Right.
Because Polaris was at the high end of Polaris was competing with the 60 level part at that point.
Right. And you bring up a very valid point. Technically, the RTX 2060 and 2070 use TU 106 instead of 104.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I mean, it's easy mistake to make because it's TU 106 400 for the 2070.
Yeah.
But
anyway,
TU 106 is designed to be the mid-range part. And because Navi is being designed as the replacement for the RX 580, essentially, and it is a full process node ahead of the 12 nanometer tech that NVIDIA is using, it's little wonder that the Navi die at 255 millimeters squared is almost half of the TU 106 die, which is 445 millimeters squared.
Basically, it's better than 1080 level performance.
That's roughly what we should expect. Yeah. And it still blows my mind that 1080 is now considered mid-range performance.
Right.
Because the 1080 is still a card that I would happily go buy off the used market for $300 to $350 and be completely satisfied with the performance day to day.
Yeah, it's still very good performance. I mean, and the fact that we're able to get this out of a part that's smaller and should provide better power and heat management.
Now, the one thing that wasn't talked about the RX 5700 series was price.
Yeah, and I'm a little worried because we had that leak not too long ago from a Sapphire employee about how the 5700 was supposed to be $500, I think.
Yeah, the leak was that the RX 570 or the RX 5700. I'm going to make that mistake so many times in the future. Yeah. How the RX 5700, based on Navi XT, was supposed to be roughly $499, which of course is roughly the same price as the RTX 2070.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't see value at that price point. I don't see value.
If they wanted to introduce it at, say, about $100 less, then that's still a little bit inflated, but...
That's still very inflated.
But I think at the $399 price point, they would have a win from a relative value perspective.
Yeah, it's still a little high. I'd still like to see it around $350, honestly, because we have to expect that a month or two later, we'll start getting the board partners custom variants to be more expensive than that. You know, they're going to have parts probably in the $400 to $450 range. And that to me is still way expensive for this level of part, man. I would, if they come out at $350, okay. But $400, that's still, I mean, this thing should be, so what was RX 480 when it came out? 250?
That's a good question.
Because when 480 came out, it was the same performance level as the GTX 980, roughly. I think the 980 was probably a little faster, but I mean, it was in the ballpark.
So the RX 480, when it launched in June of 2016, was $239 for the 8 gig variant.
So, okay, then I stand corrected. I don't want to see this at 350. I want to see this at 300.
Fair enough.
It's still more expensive than the 480 was, even if you take inflation into account.
I mean, yes, technically RX 480s did go much higher than that price, but that was, again, due to the cryptocurrency boom.
Mm-hmm. They were flying off store shelves.
Yeah, people were literally going to Best Buys, waiting for the truck to come in and buying them straight off the truck to mine with.
So
I know because I watched it happen. But,
yeah, if it's at 350, I don't know, man.
I mean, I think we may have gotten a little bit too used to AMD being the value proposition rather than the out and out performance leader.
Well, they're not going to be a performance leader because 2080 Ti exists.
Well, right, until they get whatever the sequel to the Radeon 7 is supposed to be.
I mean, honestly, even if AMD does release this at $400, I really can't knock them because Nvidia has done us a massive disservice by releasing RTX at their price points. I mean,
Which are massively inflated versus the previous generation.
2070 is ridiculous at $500. It's insane. I mean that is, to me, it's a 60 level part at $500.
Yeah, at most it is a $300 part.
At most, yes. But the fact that they stick the 70 level SKU on there, and and also the fact that they didn't have any competition, so they could get away with massively inflating prices. There's been some people recently that have given some very good analysis at why we have inflated GPU prices right now. And I won't go into specifics, but NVIDIA has done us a massive disservice with this line, with this product stack. Massive disservice. There's no reason we should be paying these GPU prices. But that's because NVIDIA, and honestly, NVIDIA makes the best graphics cards on the market. They didn't have any competition, so they were able to get away with charging $500 for a 60 level part that they named a 70, and $800 for an 80 level part. So if you look at the performance difference between the 80 level part and the 70 level part, it's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Well,
but I mean, I could talk all day about this stuff, man, but it's just beyond ridiculous. So I could see where they could get away with, charging $400 for the reference design 5700, and most will probably consider it a good value. I'm not going to consider it a good value at 400. For me, it would have to be 300. I could see 350, but it would have to be $300. And if they actually release this at $300, I'll be blown away, man. Because that would introduce market disruption.
Well, and I'm not going to hold my breath, but
yeah, I'm not either, honestly.
AMD was not the only one to announce things at Computex, though. Their main rival in the CPU space, Intel, who has been struggling with their 10 nanometer process for quite some time. Some of you who have been following the tech scene for a while may remember the original slides claiming that 10 nanometer was coming in 2015.
Yeah.
Well, 10 nanometer is finally going to make it here in the form of Ice Lake. Ice Lake U and Ice Lake Y are the mobile variants of the new Sunny Cove architecture, and Intel has said they will be releasing later this year. Note, though, no desktop processors with 10 nanometer yet.
So with this, they are seeing an IPC increase of around 18% over current 14 nanometer plus plus. But they're seeing lower clock speeds, which, if you look in history, usually when you have such an IPC gain, you do have a bit of regression with clock speed. So that's, I mean, not to segue back to the Ryzen release when they're announcing a massive IPC gain of 15% and clock speed increase. From an engineering standpoint, that is magic. That is unbelievable. But coming back to Intel, they are seeing an IPC increase. So from a mobile standpoint, it's a nice move. But they are having a bit of a regression in clock speed. So it's kind of like what we saw back in the day with the Devil's Canyon Haswell parts, and then some of the Broadwell parts, where they moved to the new node, but the Haswell parts were clocked so much higher because the node was just
mature,
far more mature. Yeah,
22 nanometer was much more mature than the 14 nanometer node of Broadwell.
Right. And that Devil's Canyon part, that was a very special part. That was a really good, really solid part at that point in time.
I mean, there, like we showed just a little while ago, the 4790K is still a solid processor in 2019, some 4 years later.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
But the Ice Lake chips show an 18% IPC gain, like you said, over, and I thought this was the important point, over Skylake.
Yeah.
Not Cabby Lake, not Coffee Lake, not Whiskey Lake, Skylake from 2016.
Yeah, but it's at least a 10 or 15% regression in clock speed. So
I mean,
they've got the IPC, but then the clock speed. So,
and that's the thing. Intel's thing for the last decade has been that they absolutely dominate on clock speed. And so if they are finally seeing a regression in clock speed with the 10 nanometer process, according to this Anantech article, the OEM listings for the Core i7 1065G7, which is apparently how the i7 part is listed, with 4 cores, 8 threads, has a base frequency of 1.3 gigahertz and a turbo of only 3.9 gigahertz.
Yeah. Whereas most of the Coffee Lake and the Cabby Lakes are I want to say boosting up to the low fours, mid fours, somewhere in there.
4.0, 4.2-ish.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, even back in the day with my Haswell chip on my my Acer 17-inch Acer laptop, had a Core i7 4702MQ, which is a Haswell part. Even it boosted to something like 3.8, 3.9.
Yeah. So the biggest gains for this, though, are going to be in the power management. So you're going to get more performance at the smaller power envelopes, like with the thin-end lights at 15 watts. Then they're going to have a decent part at 28 and then a really good one at 45. And they have a big upgrade in graphics. So they're going to be comparable to the Ryzen mobile parts in graphics.
And that is a big deal.
It is actually.
They have a graph here. You know what? I'll just go ahead and share it. You know what? I'll share several of these because there's several relevant to what we've been talking about. So here's where they talk about the 18% IPC improvement. Notice that this is taken from a number of benchmarks. And
it's an average.
It's 18% average IPC improvement. But notice there's some where they see as much as a 40% improvement in IPC. but others where they see a regression of about 1%.
Well, where they're seeing a regression is because those workloads are going to be more dependent on clock speed rather than architecture or proper optimization with parallelism. So,
And these are the other two key graphs here, where they talk about their Gen 11 Intel integrated graphics. Now, Gen 11, you'll notice, is a huge leap forward over their Gen 9 graphics in the previous generation Coffee Lake CPUs. They use the Core i7-8565U as an example. The 8565 used the 4-core 8-thread part.
mm-hmm.
Comparing it to Ice Lake U at 15 watts, notice it's anywhere from 1.42 to 2.08 times as fast in graphics. Of course, if you've used Intel's UHD 630 graphics, which is what the 8565U has, you know they aren't particularly fast to begin with. But the important comparison is down here with, like you said, Ryzen 7 3700U
mm-hmm.
at 25 watts versus Ice Lake U at 25 watts. And here we see sometimes the Ryzen part is a little faster in Dirt Rally 2.0 and in 3D Mark. But in a lot of benchmarks and a lot of games, the Ice Lake part is actually up to 15% faster in graphics performance.
Yeah, that's the more impressive chart for me.
Make it big so everyone can see. So yeah. What they use is their benchmarks. They have Fortnite 1080p low, Overwatch 1080p low.
Be right back.
Okay. Rainbow Six Siege 1080p medium, Rocket League 1080p medium, Dirt Rally 2.0, World of Tanks, 3D Mark Firestrike, 3D Mark Night Raid, and 3D Mark Skydiver. These are all fairly entry-level benchmarks, but that is impressive in and of itself. They also show this schematic here where they talk about the difference between the U series and the Y series. The U series, of course, being the ultra-low power variant, and the Y series being the mid-range, slightly more performant version. So notice we have 10th gen Intel cores. These are the Sunny Cove cores with the 300 series mobile chipset. And they largely look the same. There's a couple of minor differences between the two. But notice on the U series, you have DDR4 3200 supported. But over here on the Y series, it's DDR4 3733. So they're looking at very high-speed memory for these, which is an interesting change. So, yeah. 10th, Intel is not going down without a fight. Their 10 nanometer, yes, it's 5 years late. But it's finally out there. It's going to be out in the wild. And we'll finally be able to get our hands on it, hopefully this fall. Of course, that wasn't the only thing that Intel announced this year at Computex. Or technically, they announced just before Computex their processor that they're hoping will be able to fight against the Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9s. And that's the Core i9-9900KS. This is a Bend Core i9-9900K, 8 cores, 16 threads, but with a guaranteed 5 gigahertz all-core boost. So that is the selling point of this chip, apparently, is that it has a guaranteed 5 gigahertz all-core boost.
So what that means is it's going to cost significantly more than the new 3800X. It's probably going to be similar performance, than 3800X, but it's going to have significantly greater power draw. Significantly greater. So 9900Ks will overclock to 5 gigahertz, provided you have enough cooling. And you need very extreme cooling for these things. Like you need either anywhere from $100 to $150 air cooler, like a Noctua, like a super high-end Noctua.
Yeah, the D15 or the like.
Yeah, or the 12 variant that they just recently released, which is really good, and it rivals the D15. Or you need a good 360 mil AIO.
Yeah, their Extreme Tech here is estimating that the 9900, we already know the 9900K under full load can pull between 160 and 180 watts.
Mm-hmm.
And so if this is going to be a guaranteed 5 gigahertz chip, breaking the 200 watt barrier seems like child's play.
Yeah, I mean, you should expect anywhere from 160 to 200 watts. And that's competing against a Ryzen 7 part that eats half the power at stock. Not overclocked. Stock. And that Ryzen part will probably outperform it in lots of productivity tasks. They'll probably be, at the same performance level in terms of games, but the Ryzen part will probably outperform it in lots of productivity tasks by maybe a slim margin, or they might even trade. But the important part is AMD is giving you the same performance at half the power at stock.
Yeah, and the reviewers here who saw the 9900KS at the demo event said that it was being cooled on a high-end but fairly standard setup in an Asus ROG motherboard with a 240 millimeter ROG Ryujin 240 cooler.
Okay.
Which is pretty high-end, but it's not the 28 cores at 5 gigahertz cooled by a 1.2 kilowatt water chiller that we've come to expect from AMD, or an AMD Intel. Good grief, I'm tired.
Yeah, I'm too. So I guess what I'm trying to say, Ned, is yes, it's good. It's a good part. It performs well, but you have an AMD competing part that gives you the same performance at stock configuration. Stock configuration, same performance. Or you can take this heavily binned, heavily overclocked competing part that consumes a lot more power. It's going to be a lot more expensive than the competition's part that consumes half the power and is running at stock configuration. Stock configuration. We don't know what these parts will overclock to. We don't. But I would have to think that given the information that we do have, overclocked, the 3800X will probably consume 150 watts, 130 watts, somewhere in there, overclocked.
Mm-hmm.
But then you're probably looking at 20% better performance than the 9900KS at that point.
Well, it's a very different world from. I remember when I was looking to build. I had tinkered with PCs a lot through most of the 2000s, but I'd never outright built my own PC from the ground up until about 2007. And I remember when I was going to rebuild my system in 2010, and how through most of the early 2010s, it was AMD is the nuclear furnace and Intel is cool, quiet, and fast. Now it's almost funny to see those roles reversed.
Isn't it?
It's, I mean, yes, AMD parts, they're not, it's not like it was where the Intel parts were just utterly dominating, but AMD has provided a competitive chip that is running cooler and quieter and providing similar performance for less money. And that just blows my mind.
Well, and I mean, from what we're seeing, it's going to take Intel 2 to 3 more years to get onto the 10 nanometer plus. So
the roadmap that we talked about a few weeks ago showed that they're not considering desktop 10 nanometer manufacturing until next year. And they're not considering 10 nanometer plus till 2021.
So with that in mind, I mean, it's reasonable to expect that AMD is going to be at 7 nanometer plus TSMC next year at about this time. And then in 2 years, probably TSMC 5 nanometer.
And if that's the case, so what's going to happen to the market then?
Probably chiplet design. Intel is currently at monolithic design. So even if we were still stuck on Global Foundry 12 nanometer, if AMD just rolled out the redesign on Zen 2 at 12 nanometer with chiplet design, they'd still have a performance advantage. But they've got that and a superior process node now. You can't compete with a chiplet design with a monolithic one. You can't. The chiplet design is just
the modularity that
far
gives
superior.
The modularity that gives you means that you can. The advantage that AMD has going into this is with their chiplet design, they don't have to worry about one big monolithic die having one tiny flaw, rendering it unusable. If you have a chiplet that has a flaw, well, you've only lost one part of the processor.
Right. Well, when they're the slabs of silicone for these fabs, they're basically big discs, right? And then they imprint on them as they're making the CPU dies, and then they cut them. Well, the chiplets are smaller parts of that big slab. When you have a monolithic part, you've got bigger cuts. So that right there alone is a far more efficient way of building these chips.
Right, because you're cutting them smaller, you get more dies out of the same wafer.
Right. And you're going to have defects. You're going to have little impurities as they imprint the silicone slab. You're going to have little impurities, little defects. So with the smaller cuts, if you have defects, that's fine. You can put those in different products like the Ryzen 5, But with a monolithic design, it hurts you more because if you have impurities, that could make that entire cut
worthless,
right? Whereas they'll have other impurities where like one or two cores probably doesn't match spec, so they'll just throw that in an i3 or an i5. But with a chiplet design, see, when you're imprinting on these fabs, your best bend parts are going to be in the center. And then most of now defects can happen anywhere, but then your worst bend parts are going to be toward the outer edge.
As a general rule, yes.
Yeah. But with a chiplet design, you can pick out the little cuts that are bend better. And you can put those little chiplets on your package, and There you go. It's more efficient. You're not stuck with one big modular design or one big monolithic design. You can pick out the little pieces that are better, put it on your CPU package. You're good to go.
Speaking of
It's
giant,
far more efficient.
absolutely. Speaking of giant monolithic dies, we all remember the demonstration that Intel did last year with what would eventually become the Xeon W3175X, the 28 core monster that they had to put under a 1.2 kilowatt water chiller to actually keep cool.
Dude, as silly as that demo was, it was still kind of cool.
Well, someone decided, 5 gigahertz, that's child's play on this chip. We're going to push for 6 gigahertz.
That's crazy.
So this happened at Computex. This is Richard Lai and Joe Stepanzi. They got together at Computex and took the 255 watt Intel Xeon W3175X, ran it under liquid nitrogen, and were able to achieve, at temperatures of negative 184 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay.
They tried to push for 6 gigahertz. Sadly, they did not succeed. However, they were able to push their chip to within 150 megahertz of the current record for the Xeon W3175X at 5.5 gigahertz. The record is 5.68 gigahertz. So, but they did this all on the show floor, and I just wanted to talk about it because we make fun of Intel for that demo they did last year that got them all kinds of ridicule because they didn't talk about how, yes, it's at 5 gigahertz, but we had to put it on literally an industrial powered water chiller at 1.2 kilowatts, roughly 1 horsepower, in order to make sure that it kept cool. But when someone's taking it and just pushing the snot out of it under liquid nitrogen, that's completely different. And so my hat's off to them. They made it to 5.5 gigahertz. To Stepan's and Richard Lai, congratulations. I'm sorry you didn't get the record, but
Wow.
So
that's still crazy, man. That's impressive.
Let's see. So probably the manufacturer we heard the least from at Computex this year was NVIDIA, because let's face it, they have already put all their RTX cards out there for the most part, and the new 16 series GTX cards. But they did have a few things to talk about at Computex this year. They focused a lot on supercomputers, as well as designing computers for, quote, gamers and creators, end quote, as well as driving AI at the edge. This is all their marketing speak. So the source here is from NVIDIA's own marketing blog. So take it with a grain of salt. But they did debut a few interesting things. They debuted what they called NVIDIA EGX, which is an accelerated computing platform for manufacturing, healthcare, and transportation that allows them to use real-time AI. They also introduced new Quadro RTX mobile GPUs for creators and professionals. And they have upcoming up to 100 gaming laptops with their new Max-Q design for their RTX 20 series. They also talk about how They're introducing ray tracing to some new games. RTX is coming to Wolfenstein Youngblood. It is also coming officially to Quake 2. Now, there's been a Quake 2 mod for a while that uses RTX to fully path trace the game. This is the official RTX implementation of Quake 2. And I have to say, it does look pretty good. Considering, it's Quake 2 from 1997. Still, the one thing that caught a lot of people off guard, though, was this teaser NVIDIA put up about Super. All they did was tease the Super branding right before Computex.
I know.
Obviously, is their ploy to kind of steal some of the thunder from AMD's Navi announcement. But then we heard nothing else about it throughout the entire show till the very end, when NVIDIA finally announced 12 hours ago from when we record this that the NVIDIA Super announcement is for their new Super lineup of cards. These are going to be faster variants of the RTX 2060, 2070, and 2080. With $100 off the MSRPs and with faster GDDR6.
I'm still not impressed. I mean, they're not taking enough off the price. And I don't think that faster DDR6 memory will be that great of an improvement. I mean, now if they bend these along with the faster RAM, that might be impressive. But for me, they would have to take more off of the price.
So, yeah, unfortunately, the whole Super thing that they tried to tease wound up being kind of just a very meh marketing ploy.
So, yeah, I mean, honestly, for me, the 2060 is still honestly a 2050. The 2070 is a 2060.
That's pretty fair, I think.
When I take that into perspective, a $250 2060 or 2050 in my mind is not that impressive. Sorry.
Well, there we go. So, yeah, unfortunately, NVIDIA just did not have that much to show at Computex, at least in the way of new hardware. Of course, like I said, they had all kinds of new software, and they were touting their new Max-Q laptops, but, well, let's face it, AMD basically owned Computex this year.
Yeah, with Ryzen. Oh, yeah. And, there's some nice takeaways from the Navi thing, too, with their new architecture, where it's a hybrid GCN, and they're quadrupling the geometry performance. Oh, yeah, that's something we didn't talk about.
That's true.
One of the awesome things about Navi is how they're breaking away from GCN. So GCN's always been fantastic with compute, but weak on geometry. So they tried to address that with Navi.
Certain forms of tessellation in particular.
Yeah, where they basically beefed up the back end and the front end. So they've quadrupled the geometry performance. So when they're talking about a 1.25 to 1.5 time performance over current GCN, that's what they're referring to. Plus the 7 nanometer performance improvement there. But I think that's the most impressive thing about their RDNA architecture.
Yeah, RDNA is what they're calling it.
Or it's still GCN, but it's souped up. So
yeah, it is. It is as far removed from GCN as you can get, and still technically be able to call it GCN.
Right. Now, there's been some leaks regarding Navi 20 and how Navi 20 is going to be moving farther away from GCN even, but we'll have to wait probably till next year to get more of those details. But we're going to have to wait until E3 to get all of the specs and everything about Navi and this new super lineup that NVIDIA is talking about.
Yep, that's got to keep the teasers coming.
When's E3? When is that? 2 weeks?
In a couple of weeks from when we record this.
Yeah. Okay.
Middle of June-ish.
July 7th can't come fast enough.
Indeed.
All right.
We have a couple other minor announcements from Computex. This one was interesting. G.Skill unveils a new 384 gigabyte DDR4 4000 kit, as well as 16 gigabyte DDR4 5200 memory kits. They have their brand new Trident Z DDR4 5200 speed RAM sticks that they're making available. 16 gigabytes, 2x8 gigabytes at DDR4 5200. That's 5,200 megahertz effective.
So that kind of comes back to another thing that has been said about or leaked about Ryzen 3000 and the X570 chipset, is that it will be far more friendly to RAM, especially higher speed RAM. And so there's lots of information getting leaked out now, or rumors, about 4,000 and greater speed memory.
And AMD's not the only one embracing high-speed memory. While you had to step away, I was talking about how on Ice Lake, Intel is embracing DDR4 3200 on the mobile side, where mobile traditionally has been DDR4 2133 or 2400, and they claim that Ice Lake Y will support speeds up to 3733 megahertz, which is very impressive for a mobile part.
Which would further help its Iris graphics.
Exactly.
Interesting.
But yeah, the standout here in this list from G.Skill. I'm not sharing the list. So the standout in the list here, though, is this one. The Ripjaws 5 kit. 384 gigabytes. That's 12 by 32 gigabyte DIMMs. It's designed for this platform.
It's designed for HEDT.
Yep. Well, specifically, it's designed for the Xeon W3175X and Intel's LGA 3647 socket, which has hexachannel memory. That's 6 channels. So I thought that was pretty neat. I have no idea, and there's no way I'd be willing to pay for a 384 gigabyte RAM kit. But that's pretty awesome that they're considering that for the consumer space.
That's crazy.
I mean, I've heard of servers with well in excess of that number, but geez, the fact that they're offering that potentially in the consumer space is mind-blowing.
Those are
so good on you,
G.Skill, right there.
Oh yeah, so these were more rigs from G.Skill that were designed to kind of show off their RAM in its various forms.
Okay.
But they have some pretty nice systems there and some nice water cooling loops.
Yeah.
It helps to have the bling if you want people to notice your product.
Exactly.
So cool stuff from G.Skill.
Yeah.
All right. Our last news item. This one I think is going to be of most interest to you, Jason. And this is Corsair's new Hydro X initiative, which they launched at Computex 2019. Basically, Corsair is getting into water cooling.
Yeah, this stuff looks pretty cool. They're basically partnering up with different players in the market. So for their fittings, they're partnering up with Bits Power. For their radiators, gosh, For the radiators, they're partnering up with
I was going to say, I seem to remember they were doing some work with EK, but I think that was on the blocks.
Yeah, it's probably the blocks, because with the radiators, it's oh gosh darn it, they're really big name in radiators. They're really, really good. Well, Bits Power makes some of the best fittings out there.
Right.
Blocks, you can't go wrong with EK. The reservoir and pump combos are interesting. So with water cooling, you basically have two kinds of pumps. You've got the D5 and the DDC. So one is a high flow. One's a high flow, low speed, or some I forget. They're basically two different principles. One's high flow, the other one's low flow.
One is high pressure, and one is high flow.
Right. Yeah. So I want to. So one is high pressure, low flow. The other is high flow, low pressure. So the D5 is the. I want to say it's the high pressure, low flow, and then the DDC is the high flow, low pressure. I forget. But they're going to have DDC and D5 pumps. They're going to have reservoir and pump combos.
I'm going to share photos of these because they are really quite beautiful.
Yeah, they do look really good.
This is a view of the pump reservoir combo that Jason was talking about. There's one of the blocks. You'll notice it's on an MSI X299 Tomahawk.
Okay, so yeah, it's the other way around. The D5 is the higher flow rate, lower pressure, whereas the DDC is higher pressure but lower flow rate. So where that comes into practice is in a water cooling loop, the most restriction you're going to have is lots of bends or in your blocks. So typically your CPU block, your GPU blocks, those are going to have the most restriction. So if you're going to have lots of blocks, you basically want a higher flow rate. If you have a lower amount of blocks, then most people just run the D5 because it runs quieter, it's cooler, and if you've got a typical loop's going to have one GPU, one CPU, a D5 will do you just fine. You know, your radiators are not going to have much restriction, so it just kind of comes down to how you design your loop. Now, if you're going to have like an SLI or a crossfire setup, you're probably better off getting a DDC, but a D5 will still work just fine. So it kind of comes down to what your build is, how many blocks you have, how restrictive those blocks are. Sometimes you need a higher pressure to overcome the restriction in the blocks.
Yeah, take a look at this particular system that I've got on the screen here, where they have the 3 different reservoirs for 3 different loops.
Holy cow.
Notice they have 2, those are 420 millimeters.
Okay, so they have, that's interesting. So they've got, this is a case that has
dual systems.
3 radiators, right? And then it's got, so it's got 3 360 radiators. It's got,
actually it has 1 360 and 20s.
Oh, so 2 420s. So okay, they're 3 by 140 mil. Okay, so it's got a CPU and a GPU loop on the ATX system, and then there's a smaller ITX system with a monoblock. Okay.
And the way they've got it all nice and neatly plumbed, and each loop is a different color. I thought that was pretty neat.
That is pretty cool. That is pretty cool.
Let's say, I think they had another view of it. Yeah, right here. But you can see they have mini ITX system cooled by the red photo and 360 up top, and then they have I'm presuming since it's blue, it's probably an Intel CPU, and the red one's probably an AMD APU or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then green, of course, cooling the GeForce GTX graphics card. So, cute way to present that, Corsair.
I really like how those radiators look, by the way.
Yes, that I love the Corsair and I have had a tumultuous relationship over the years. In particular, when Corsair did their Corsair gaming lineup, when they did that really dumb tribal logo for a while,
Mm-hmm.
I refused to buy anything Corsair for quite some time after that. But after they went back to that really clean, Corsair sales logo like they have on the side of the pumps and the side of the radiator there, I mean, one of the reasons I would go with Corsair over other brands in the past was because it looked clean in a way that didn't scream, this is a gaming PC, or this is not something to be taken seriously. It was clean and it was professional.
Mm-hmm.
It was one of the reasons I liked the Corsair 600T, which I still have that case to this day.
That's a good case.
And one of the reasons why Corsair was one of my go-to options, I mean, there was a long while that I used Corsair RAM exclusively. And then when Corsair branched out into other stuff,
Mm-hmm.
I started using some of their other things. And there was a long while I only used Corsair AIOs. But, over the years, they've had some ups and downs. Corsair Gaming, their original release of the Corsair Gaming with all the wacky yellow stuff and that silly tribal logo, that's just best left forgotten. But yeah, this Hydro X stuff, it looks really clean. I really like the look of it. It's a nice neutral. It's a nice neutral silver and black, which can be made to go with pretty much anything.
Yeah. I don't know what the pricing on the blocks is going to be. I mean, they're only introducing blocks for the RTX line and some of the Pascals. Like you can get, they're going to be. I think they announced a GTX 1070, 1080, and 1080 Ti blocks, and then all the RTX line. I don't know about 2060, but 2070 and up probably. I don't know what the blocks are going to cost, but the pump and reservoir combo prices aren't bad. I want to say they're between 140 and 160, which, I mean, you can get better prices out there for other, from other brands, but it's not out of the realm. I'm assuming those 360 rads are going to cost right around 90 or 100.
That would make sense given the market pricing right now.
Yeah. Well, an Alpha Cool Slim rad's going to cost you about 100 for 360.
Right.
XSPC you can get cheaper. And I mean, if you shop around, you can get cheaper for copper and brass radiator. But
I mean, I'm using a SwiftTech at the moment in my other PC, but it was one of SwiftTech's kits, the H220X, which sadly they don't sell anymore.
Yeah, it's too bad.
They had to quit selling them because Asetek sued them. Your design is too similar to the one that we make. License our design or else.
Right. Shame on you for putting a pump in your CPU block. Shame on you. That just makes too much sense.
And how dare you attach a reservoir to your radiator.
We don't do that. We don't put reservoir in our AIOs.
All right. Well, that's all our news items. We do have a few hardware deals for all of our lovely viewers this week. And these are relatively affordable, even compared to some of the ones we've talked about in the past. We have one that's less than $30. We have one that's $65. And one that, after the promo code, is only $90. So let me go ahead and share my screen one last time.
What?
And so our first deal this week is the Team Group GX2 256 gigabyte SATA 3 internal solid state drive. This is a 2.5-inch solid state drive. Of course, it's SATA 3, so it's limited to about 550 megabytes per second reads and similar speed writes. But really, this drive makes the point that at this point, there really is no reason why you shouldn't have a boot drive of an SSD. Because this is a 256 gigabyte drive for $26.
That's crazy.
For less than you would pay for a dinner at a good steakhouse.
Right. I mean, if I'm taking, so with my 3 kids and I, if we all go to McDonald's, like, we're really hurting to get below $25 some nights. So that's McDonald's for 4 people. You get an SSD instead. All right, kids. Daddy bought an SSD. We're going to have to eat at home tonight. Sorry. You're welcome.
So, yeah, in all seriousness, though, for $26, there is no reason why you should not get an SSD. They had all the marketing speak down here, but the key thing, okay, 500 megabytes per second max reads, 400 megabytes per second max writes. Not the fastest drive out there, but you know what? At this price, does it really matter?
No. And that reminds me, Ned. That reminds me. You know what the best part of X570 is?
The fact that it's PCIe 4.0.
Uh-huh.
Which means even
really
faster
cool
NVMe drives.
Uh-huh. Like double the performance.
Spoiler, we're going to be talking about one.
Okay.
But first, let's talk RAM. If I told you you could get a 16 gigabyte kit of DDR4 3000, what would you expect to pay?
Of DDR4 3000?
Mm-hmm.
Of how? So, like a 16 gig kit, 2 8s?
2 8 gig sticks at DDR4 3000.
Current prices, well, we've seen sales around $75. I don't know. I could see between 75 and 90.
Well, how about $10 cheaper than that at 65?
Wow, it's TechForge too.
Yep, this is Team T-Force Vulcan Z, 16 gigs of DDR4 3000. This is one of the lowest prices I've seen for a DDR4 3000 kit.
Nice.
At $65. And as you can see, from the time we're recording this, this will probably upload the morning after. So you still have 6 days to buy this. So from the time this video goes up, you've got 6 days. Earlier this week, I was at my local Best Buy, or as I like to call it, Worst Purchase. And I thought it was a deal when I saw a 16 gigabyte kit of DDR4 RAM, 3000 speed for $80. But this at 65 makes me really glad I didn't buy it.
Well, $80 is not a bad price either.
Well, no, but
65, wow.
Yeah, $15 less.
And free shipping.
Indeed. And finally, now we have seen the Intel 660p advertised at lower prices than this. But the catch is, to get the best deal on this, you technically have to use a code. One that I'm going to share right now. If you enter that code, EMCTAWU22, at checkout, you will get $19 off this SSD. Now, the Intel 660p is a NVMe PCIe 3.0x4 SSD. It is not the fastest NVMe SSD because it does use QLC NAND flash, which is the slowest form of NAND flash, but it also has the best data density. It's the reason you can get a 1 terabyte NVMe SSD for under $100.
Wow.
So for $90.99 after this promo code, after that promo code that I have highlighted on screen, you get $19 off this price, meaning for $91, you can get a 1 terabyte SSD for your boot drive. So if you've got a little more money to spend, you could get this for a relatively recent machine. Or if you have an older machine, the $25 deal we talked about earlier is fine for you.
Man, that's awesome.
I had a friend of mine earlier today. He was trying to do some stuff. We were trying to set up some streaming for him. And unfortunately, his laptop came equipped with a 1 terabyte 5400 RPM hard drive. So he was getting stutters galore, not because of his network, but because his hard drive was failing to keep up with the stream and the game.
At some point, you have to have realistic expectations when you're streaming.
Fair, but this was one of the first times he'd ever tried to do it. So, okay. He didn't know, and so I pointed him toward this deal for that 256 gigabyte SSD.
Nice, because
he has a 3-year-old laptop. It will make a world of difference, and will. I mean, I remember.
Yep.
I remember with my laptop that I'm still using, it's from 2015, and the improvement in day-to-day usability from going from a hard drive to an SSD is really difficult to explain. It is something that has to be experienced.
Well, yeah, I mean that's hands down the best upgrade for anybody to get. Period. If you're coming from a hard drive, make a case for RAM, make a case for CPU or graphics card, but SSD is bar minimum the upgrade to get.
Particularly when you're in a form factor where you don't have access as much to upgrading the system like a laptop.
Right.
Where basically the only upgrades you can typically make are RAM and storage.
Right.
And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of our show for this week. Jason, you have anything else you want to add to our Computex wrap-up?
No, other than I'm really looking forward to seeing the reviews for the new Ryzen and even the Navi stuff. I think we're in for a real treat when we start seeing those reviews and what that entire platform brings for the new SSDs coming out on the new PCIe spec, how the new Ryzens will perform. I think a lot of people will be surprised. This is a change that we haven't. This is a change unlike we've really ever witnessed before. where we're seeing a change of the hat, actually, from one company to the next. AMD is giving you better performance at less money, at less power. Period. Intel has no answer for what AMD is introducing for the desktop. That will trickle into enterprise and mobile as well.
Okay.
And then PCI Express 4, and then everything else. It's I can't wait to see the reviews. Period. So
I fully agree, and I'd say I'd have to say in general, we've got E in the corner where we're going to find out even more about Navi and about NVIDIA Super.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just over a month away from the release of Ryzen 3000.
Yep.
It is an exciting time to be a PC hardware enthusiast.
Yeah, I mean the jump from Zen Plus to Zen 2 is enough for me to consider upgrading. And honestly, 2700X is way more CPU than I need for day-to-day stuff.
Yeah, a 15% IPC performance improvement, generation to generation, is significant.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we've been seeing Intel, we talked about earlier in the show, Intel touted an 18% performance increase for an architecture that's 4 years old.
With a regression in clock speed.
With a reduction in clock speed. To see an increase in clock speed and a improvement in IPC from one generation to the next is not something that we've seen in probably since the change from the original Core I series to Sandy Bridge. That was probably the last time we've seen a leap like that.
Well, and even then, we didn't see 15%. We saw probably 8.
8 to 12%, yep.
So, and there wasn't that I don't think there was that great a leap in clock speed. There was, but not as great as we're seeing from 12 or 14 nanometer to 7. And again, we don't know how these are going to overclock or behave.
Right. That was the big thing about Sandy Bridge, was it had a huge amount of headroom. We don't know about Ryzen 3000 yet, how much headroom it actually has.
Nope. All we're seeing is leak and speculation.
So
4.5 at 1.35 volt is realistic from what we're seeing, but those are engineering samples, not binned retail. It's likely we could see all core overclocks at 4.8. I don't know. We don't know.
And well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you for joining us once again for the TechForge podcast. If you enjoyed what you've seen here, of course, you can always check out all of our content here on our YouTube channel. You can also find us here at CrossForge Gaming 5 nights a week, Monday through Friday, on our Twitch channel at twitch.tv/CrossForgeGaming. And you can also find links down below to all our social media with Facebook, Twitter, and our Discord community. In the meantime, I've been Ned. This has been TechForge. And remember, when life has you down, Jesus loves you, and forge on.
Forge on.